Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Defiant Takes Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean. We're live here with Nick Merriam, our draft expert and director. Nick, how you doing today, man?
Pretty well. We're getting very close to that Senior Bowl trip, and lots of preparations to be made, but exciting stuff.
Yeah, man. I've been very apprehensive over the past couple of weeks since we decided we want to do this to see if there was going to be anything cropping up that might get in the way of this trip. So I was kind of a little bit reserved, but now it looks like we are actually going to be there. I'm very excited to help us out with the show today. Although you might not be around super long, we've got our producer, Noah Ashley. Noah, how you doing, man?
Doing a lot better than I was last week. Feeling pretty good.
You sounded rough, brother. You sounded pretty rough. So did you get sick on the way over there? I can't remember. Or was it?
No, I went out.
Flew?
I went out to celebrate my birthday with my friends here, and I just got something from somebody. Just a little bit of flu, I think.
Yeah, it was going around, man. That's things. I got it back in October pretty badly, and it's making its way through. So glad that you're feeling better. Thanks for all your effort to set up the show today. It's a good one, too.
Man. No problem.
Of course. So it's a good one. We are going to do a brief post-mortem on the divisional teams. I know we said we weren't going to. We're going to do a quick one, not spend as much time, but the bulk of the show, we're going to be talking about all of the head coach openings ranked. And we are also going to talk a little bit about the mass firing of the offensive coordinators around the NFL and some of the trends that coaching staffs have been making over this past season. So I'm interested to get into that. So I think let's jump right into it, man, because we got plenty to talk about today. I don't have our depth charts up, and I'm not sure how helpful they really were to begin with. But first team to talk about today is the Jacksonville Jaguars. We have them slated to be at $13.96 million over the cap. They also have a first, second, third, 2 fourths, 3 sixths, and a seventh. So a solid assortment of draft picks. They have made a number of high picks over the past couple of years because some of the GMs have been a little all over the place, between Caldwell and now Balky. Most of those rebuilding picks have already been made, but they're not lacking picks. They can free up money as well. They're an expensive defense that probably underperformed a little bit, so they're guys that they can release to create space pretty quickly. So in terms of where they kind of lie in their future going forward, the fact that they're flexible and they have a young quarterback is clearly a nice place to be, especially with the head coach. But Nick, where would you say that their season, I don't want to say went wrong, they made it all the way to the divisional round, but where would you say they lacked a little bit, and what has kept them out of the conference championships now?
Well, I still think they're a little bit young. I think that the lack of focus on, quite frankly, the trenches has been an issue for them. Now, that's not necessarily like a bad thing. I think they really, just in terms of the draft, have taken guys where they fit consensus-wise, and it just hasn't really lined up with the trenches that often for them. But other than that, I think that, maybe they could have delineated positionally a little bit more. They really had a focus on weapons this last offseason. They added a lot of linebackers, which is a little strange. But it's not like a bad thing. They're just kind of young, and it's a developing roster. Overall, I think Balky had, like a target on his head after last year. A lot of people wanted him fired. And I don't think he's done an excellent job as general manager, but I think some of the moves that they've made last year really looked better after another year of them being in that system. They were the new head coach and, just like a new culture altogether. And I would assume that they kind of have a nice sustained organizational setup for now going forwards.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I don't even think that they've ignored the trenches. I think they've specifically ignored offensive line. Because if you think about it, over the past however many drafts, they've drafted Taven Bryan, Caleb Chason, Josh Allen, and now Walker.
Yeah.
Walker as well. So, maybe underwhelming picks for some of them, but like that's a lot of defensive linemen. I mean, it called Shaquille on defensive lineman or whatever guy, but so that's a fair amount of investment over the past few years. But the investment hasn't necessarily worked out for some of those guys. Obviously, Chason and Brian in particular are the biggest disappointments. And despite having a really good rookie season, Josh Allen hasn't really developed into a dominant edge player. So they're kind of hoping for that from Walker. And but it's the offensive line where they haven't really made the investments that we would like. They haven't made a first-round pick on the O-line since Luke Jokel, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So it's been a while, and obviously different management back then. But that's something that I think that they do need to address. And they have their left tackle, most likely. I mean, he's under contract for a few years, so I don't think you definitely need to blow that up and bring in another guy. But I think adding another guy to the left guard position, to center potentially, and then you could think about moving their rookie, who was a backup left tackle this year, over to right tackle when Jawan Taylor walks. But I mean, that's all feasible options, and they could go another direction too. But I think realistically, having that quarterback situation, having the head coach situation that's clearly working well together, like that is the first step. And with all of these postmortems we've talked about, if they have that, we've felt pretty good about where the team is going forward. If they don't have that, it's just such a difficult question to answer. And it's not that many teams in the NFL that have the head coach quarterback combo that you feel good about.
Yeah, and I think they made a real point this offseason after a year of just it really not working with Trevor Lawrence as a rookie at Urban Meyer. Like, it was a disaster of just not messing it up. Like, they had to go out of their way to make sure they had a coach that had a high floor of outcomes, right? Doug Peterson was never going to be a disaster culturally for them. They made sure to upgrade at weapons positions. They spent a lot of money to make sure that they would upgrade at weapons positions, but at least they had the focus of like, hey, our receivers were really bad last year and dropped a lot of passes. We need to get better. We don't care if we overspend. Like, we're going to get better at those positions because they're important to our quarterback's development. He needs to get better. And to go with that, like, yeah, they gave Evan Ingram a good amount of money, but it was a one-year deal. Yeah, they gave Zay Jones a good amount of money, but it's a deal they can get out of in a year. Christian Kirk deal, maybe not the same, but that's
he was pretty good this year, though.
He was decent. I still think he was pretty overpaid, but I mean, they did what they could to make sure that the receiving core was not a disaster. And it was good enough to let Lawrence develop and really be the best player on that offense. And then defensively, I think the position they paid a lot of was corner, but they never spent high. Like paying Shaq late, it's not Shaq. Shaq Mason's the guard.
No, yeah. They paid Foye Oluokun.
They paid Oluokun, which I was not as big a fan of. I know we talked about how many tackles he got the other day, but I was not as big a fan of that, especially when they drafted their linebacker in Lloyd, and I thought he was better this year. But they paid Darius Williams 2 years ago on a cheap deal, and he's been pretty good. So I think the $10 million market for corners is like one of the most valuable markets in the NFL. Like, there's always these number 2 corners that are pretty decent. They get a little underpaid. Like Kendall Fuller is in that realm of like contract where it's like he got 4 years, $40 million, and has been like a really good player. That Williams signing was good for them.
You're talking about the corner that they signed from Seattle.
Seattle's Shaq, whose last name I can't remember, and Williams is the one from the Rams. But yes, they've signed a couple corners. They drafted Tyson Campbell, who also has developed. Like, they had that position. They really went out of their way to like get 3 guys who have an upside, and that's helped them too. They haven't been a great defense, but just everywhere outside of quarterback, they've made sure that there aren't like any like fantastically large holes on this roster. There's nothing that's like, oh, that's a real problem. You're going to get exposed unless you're going up against, an Aaron Donald on the defensive line, or a Calvin Johnson at wide receiver in the opposition. Like, it's just that's what's giving them problems. They need to find maybe a few more blue chip players to really put this roster over the top.
Yeah, and some of that might come from development. Some of them might come from free agency or the draft. But yes, and Shaq Griffin.
Shaq Griffin, right?
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the New York Giants. The Giants are loaded with cap space right now. Not the tops in the league, but definitely a substantial amount of money to make moves. Some of that will probably be designated to Daniel Jones, more likely than not. But 54.2 million is available. We've got a first, second, 2/3, 2/4, a fifth, 2/6, and 3/7. So they've got ammunition to move around however they see fit. They're picking, obviously, any of these teams who have their own pick that are picking the first round would be later in the first round. So it's not a surefire, immediate contributor. But between Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal, they've got some major investments in the trenches. Kayvon had a nice year when he came back from injury. And I know I'm frozen right now, but can you still hear me all right?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. And Neal, he had a few flashes. He struggled a bit, but we know that rookie offensive linemen often have issues as rookies and progress comfortably. It's not really a major red flag in any way, shape, or form. Especially with Andrew Thomas, teams did try to get their edge rushers on the other side if they could. And that's a tough out for a rookie. So we'll see how he develops. The overall offensive line wasn't bad. They were able to get a lot out of guys that we didn't necessarily have high expectations for going into the year. Saquon Barkley was a big one. The way that he bounced back was key to the overall success that they had throughout the season and in the playoffs. And Daniel Jones working well with Brian Daboll was a big deal. But the real question is, what do they want to do with Daniel Jones going forward? Because it would make sense to lock him in at least until you go out and get your guy that you want to marry yourself to, because you know what he is. You can't just completely wash away everything else that's happened throughout his career, right? It might not be a big deal, like as big of a deal as we thought, but it's not like he has all this great tape. And even this year, it was much better in terms of turnovers, but he's not sitting back there reading the full field, making all the throws. The fact that he was able to be efficient and run the ball a lot was, one of the big things. And I'm just not sure what your ceiling would be with that. So, I mean, we've talked about it a lot, so you don't have to go too far into it, but where do you feel about them with Daniel Jones, and how aggressive should they be in trying to find a replacement?
They should be pretty aggressive, but I don't know. We don't really know where these quarterbacks are going in this draft this year. I don't know what the deal is with Lamar Jackson. I don't know how willing this team is to invest a bunch of picks because of where the roster state is right now. And quite frankly, like, let's say you acquired a top quarterback, they might be good enough to win a bunch of playoff games anyways, just because of Daboll and a quarterback would be a pretty impressive combination. But I mean, this is honestly a team that's very similar to the team we just talked about, like Jacksonville. I think their roster, as it turns out, it's not terrible, but they don't really have much like upside at any one position, and lacking like a Trevor Lawrence is kind of the difference between these team and them. Although Doug Peterson's a good coach and Daboll's like a great coach. This is a team that has pass rushers, but they're not as good at run defending as we saw against the Eagles. They have decent corners, but there's no like number one, like amazing player in that defensive secondary. Linebackers need to be upgraded. Like receivers, like they have a bunch of like guys who could be wide receiver twos and they're on their best days, but they're not, they like lack a number one guy. They're developing some tight ends. I think ultimately they're not going to end up paying Saquon. I think we kind of have seen like the seeds of that beginning to be spread, where they said like, this is what we offered him. He didn't want it. It was like $12 million a year contract. I think if Saquon wants more than that, he's probably going to end up somewhere else. Daniel Jones, I expect, will be back, probably even maybe at a cheaper deal than people would expect, just because I think it's in his best interest to stay with this current coaching staff. I don't know how much to trust him.
To revitalize his career. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think with Saquon, I will jump in just because we haven't seen free agent running backs get paid by anybody in a long time. It's been a while. So Le'Veon Bell was the last one, and that did not work out. And it was already generally considered a bad idea then. and that just reinforced it. The only large contracts we've seen to running backs have all been extensions because teams have eyes on those guys.
Yeah.
And it's done before the player is like fully in free agency. So I think you can fully expect them to put the franchise tag on them. They've got plenty of space, so that's an easy move.
Well, they said they don't expect to tag either, but I don't know. Maybe they're just saying that as possible.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I didn't see specifically who said that. It depends on where it comes from.
Yeah, I don't remember who said it. I will. One thing I want to add in though that happened this year, and I think has changed some minds with the running back position, even if I don't agree with it, is people look at the Niners and say that the Christian McCaffrey trade was a big success, which is incredible short term like outlook and not really like putting it all
depending on how you view it. It is a great success, but also he is one of one player who is as good of a receiver as most number twos or potentially even number ones, depending on the team. So it's like that is really where he makes his money because as a runner, he's very good, but what he does as a runner is not rare per se in the NFL.
Yeah.
But what he does as a receiver is incredibly rare, and the versatility that provides means that they can move Debo in and move McCaffrey out or whatever they want to do, and somebody's creating a mismatch, right? It's like we talked about before. Just because you have a player who's a mismatch, and you want to move him, that can also provide a mismatch in the defense's favor somewhere else. So having all those guys who can win in a number of different ways really helps the Niners. So I hear you. That's a little short-sighted, maybe a little limited of a viewpoint when it comes to the running back position as a whole. But, I mean, I don't know. I would franchise tag him. I really would. Because unless they expect him to go out and try and find a deal that's not better than what he was offered in New York and then to come back, that's also possible. But that's a major coin flip for the best player on your team, to be honest. But I don't know. I mean, look, the bonus for them is that they're playing with house money. And so even if they take a step back this year, it's probably fine. I think we put Anthony Richardson to them in our quarterback matchup carousel earlier this year. And I think I really like that. As a developmental type.
As guy. I see things developing here, I don't know that Richardson's they're gonna have to trade up.
Well, that's fine. They have ammunition. They've got 2 3s, 2 4s, 2 6s, 3 7s. They can move up for sure.
So. But I would not count out in this draft just the way things are going. The chance that 4 quarterbacks go in the top 5 picks, and then they would be completely out of it if that was the case.
I don't believe that's going to happen.
I think it could, just because I think you could see the Panthers trading up, the Raiders trading up. Like there could be a lot of teams jockeying.
We always say this. And most of the time, it really doesn't happen.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
because what happens is teams do their homework on other teams, and then one team trades up, and then the other team's like, all right, well, like,
when's the last time you saw a team go from the 26th position to top 12 and like make a pick on a quarterback, though? Like the last time was Mahomes and Watson, and I think that draft was like a specific draft where people were undervaluing the quarterbacks.
Well, I mean, that's fair, but
I think they're overvaluing this year. Probably a little bit.
I don't know. We'll see. Well, that's a conversation for a later day. But but I think that they have the possibility of opportunity to go after a quarterback if they so choose. They're picking in what would be the mid to late 20s. Now, I forget what their exact pick is. I didn't write it down. I'm guessing like 25-ish. 26. So they can move up. They can. I mean, I think things like this really go back and forth. It's not the same quarterback draft that we had in 2021. It's not the same quarterback draft that we had in 2018. It's not quite that, but I mean, even then, the Bills made the playoffs and traded up to the 6?
Yeah, so it was the 20. They had the 22 and 21 pick that year, and they didn't deal either. They flipped. They traded twice, right? They traded from 21 to 12. They flipped Cordy Glenn, who's a tackle, not here anymore, to the Bengals to flip picks, and then they sent 2 second-round picks that they both had that year to Tampa to move up another 5 spots, and they got Josh Allen with the 7th pick. And even in that year, like I think, like the Giants took Saquon number 2. Like the Broncos could have gone quarterback, and they took Bradley Chubb at 5. Like it required some teams to not take quarterback. So I think the Giants have an opportunity, but they're going to have to invest a good amount of resources.
I'm just saying, where did the front office from the Giants come from?
Yeah, they came from Buffalo. I will say, I think if they want to upgrade at quarterback, we're going to know about it relatively soon, because I think they're going to have to start making moves early to make sure it can be a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. But they already have a really nice assortment of draft picks. They don't necessarily have a lot of players to flip and deal. But look, if you can sucker a team into moving back for Cordy Glenn, then you could probably sucker somebody into something to move up a little bit. But we'll see. We'll see about that. I think it just makes a lot of sense based on where their roster is, because, what's going to make a difference for them? Do they want to draft a corner this year and then wait until next year to draft a quarterback that will take time to develop? Even Josh Allen didn't make playoffs in his first year with Dable. So it's like, even though they are in a good place, you are just kind of postponing the inevitable. So I think if you see a guy that you like, you go up and get him.
Yeah. You just gave me an idea for an off-season content thing we could do, which is just like recapping past drafts, because I think it's just so fun to like look back historically at like some of the decisions.
Yeah, for sure. We'll do that 100%. Like maybe we'll do a Thursday show that is like best all-time like draft finagling, worst all-time draft finagling, just like so. Like basically some of the best and worst decisions, not just straight up picks, because obviously anybody can just look and that's a good pick, that's a bad pick, but how we got to that, to where we did. But speaking of the Bills, let's talk about them next. The Bills have about $8.5 million in cap space. They have some expensive players. They can create some space if they so choose, with some restructures, some of their higher priced players. They'll get Von Miller back. They have to make some decisions on some expensive players that are walking in free agency, or at least projected to. Jordan Poyer, Micah Parsons, Tremaine Edmonds. But other than that, the majority of those guys are expected to be back. They have a 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 2 5. So not a ton of picks, but they're all relatively high. So if you do want to add some roster depth, you can make some small trade backs, add a 6th year, add a 7th there, so you can have a few extra picks if you like. I think that's something that they should be aware of, just because they are kind of getting their window is still open, but they're getting into the window where their quarterback's cap hit is it's going to increase over time. Stephon Diggs is still too good to really consider moving on from. So like some of these big expensive players, they're still going to be here. So if you want depth that's not just, UDFAs and vet minimum guys, you need to add some more later round picks, but that's very doable. So relatively easy. And then again, coaching staff and quarterback, among the best in the NFL. So they're in a great spot overall.
There's been a lot of like just ridiculous things being said on Twitter, not just about this team, but also like the Chiefs if they lose this weekend, about the outlook of these organizations. Like it's just so stupid. Like, oh, they lost the divisional round. What a disaster. Dude, you know how much I would give to win like 13 games in a season? That's ridiculous. Like I don't even it's just so silly.
The expectations for what is supposed to happen with an NFL team is insane. I mean, I don't even know if this is real, but Greg from Cover One, he's funny on Twitter, and he posted a screenshot of somebody in a Bills Facebook group that had smashed their TV and their glass table, and like he had a whole bunch of house guests over, and they all left, and
even that's
kids
like
were
fans though. Like I mean, like
that's
they're
what
like
I mean.
there's
That's
like
what
media members though who are
but
like,
they are just feeding into the fan
yeah,
stuff. Look,
yeah, I
I mean,
guess.
come on. I mean, you know as well as I do that the majority of outlandish things that are said are knowingly said, at least to some degree. Like you don't get that far and just have zero awareness of how this all works. So, but
Yeah.
it's just like it's the Buffalo fans are emotional, and you understand why. It's been a long time. They're very invested. It means a lot to them. But that is ridiculous. And it was like they said something like they burned their Josh Allen jersey and they're not a Bills fan because they were embarrassed. Like, you should not be embarrassed. You did not do anything. Like, unless you bet a bunch of money, then you should be embarrassed, but you embarrass yourself. I just mean that is just a taste. And look, it's happening with Dallas. We'll talk about here in a minute too. The expectations. The expectations are always unreasonable. It is unreasonable to expect to go to the Super Bowl.
Yep.
Only 2 out of 32 teams can make it. I mean, it is what it is. So
the Chiefs have hit the pinnacle of expectations, and their definition of a disappointing season is not making the AFC Championship game, in my opinion. Like their expectation is like where they are now. And it's not a disappointment per se if they don't get and win a Super Bowl because it's really hard to. Like, I don't know. Like, the weird comparison I like to come up with for everyone is like the U.S. men's national soccer team. It's like the expectation now for them and every World Cup is to make the round of 16, right? Like, we're at that point where, okay, they're like consistently making the round of 16. They should make the round of 16. No one is shocked when they lose in the round of 16. But if they ever win and get to the quarterfinals, like, okay, you've like broken, like that's a big win for them, right? We need to like get used to more often having this consideration of expectations versus like success. I don't want to say like it's like a binary thing, but it's like there's only so many outcomes, right? So there's not like your reactions are very much going to be, if you're overreacting one way or the other, just know that that's like the only thing that could have happened is they either lose this week, win in 2 weeks, or lose in 2 weeks. And because there's only 3 different outcomes, you're really going to have only like 3 different reactions. Therefore, to have like such a abject difference in reactions to me, it's just kind of like, I know like as a fan, like that makes sense to me, but just I do think there are media members who are kind of like still like, what is wrong with this organization not winning a Super Bowl this year? And it's like, I don't know, man. It's tough. Like it's hard to win. Like I
is. I mean, but you know, at this point, we might be in a place where the AFC, as good as it is ruled by 2 teams because Joe Burrow is becoming that good right now. So
I don't think the Bills are that far behind the Bengals. I really do think it's like that situationally that game played to Cincy quite a bit. I don't think that game was like the Bengals are better than the Bills this year, but I don't think that they're 17 points better, you know? So it's run it back, add some pieces. You could very well win 15 games next year and roll to a Super Bowl, and it wouldn't shock anybody, you know?
We got to keep an eye on, for sure. We got to keep an eye on how the Bengals' health looks over the next couple of years because they have been ridiculously healthy going into playoffs 2 consecutive years now. And so, you know, and there's no saying they would not have made the playoffs if Burrow stayed healthy as a rookie. So it's funny because I think you tweeted, and it's like it's obviously everybody kind of knows. Mahomes has never not made the AFC Championship game as a starter. Well, the same is true for Joe Burrow technically because he got hurt early enough in his rookie season that like you kind of have to call that a wash, at least in terms of like a stat like that. So at this point, you know, he's on a nice trajectory as well. But when you compare the health of those 2 teams, I mean, Von Miller not playing, huge deal. Micah Hyde not playing, huge deal. Like both really, really important players for their defense. And Tre'Davious White missed the playoffs last year because of his torn ACL. It was an ACL, right?
Yeah. Poyer was also playing, I believe, with an injury that they just like didn't fix immediately, and he was just like playing injured.
He was hurt all year, but he played through the majority of it. And Josh Allen got his elbow hurt too. So it's like, even though he made a lot of incredible throws, for sure that was still bothering him to some degree. There's no way that it wasn't.
I think
So
for a team with a quarterback of that level, I think those are like the three best. I mean, I know Herbert's quite good, but I think maybe he deserves to be in a tier with like Allen and Burrow. But I would say the three best quarterbacks in football are Burrow, Allen, and Mahomes.
mhm.
Especially when you're paying your quarterback. So this doesn't really apply to the Bengals, but they've kind of done it anyways. Your job is to find an identity where there's one other unit that really can put you over the top in case your quarterback doesn't have his best game. In the case, I think, of the Chiefs and Bengals, it's their weapons. Cincy, obviously, just like the receivers they have. And the Chiefs, I think, despite losing Tyreek Hill, like really did go out and add a lot at that position. And I just like to the degree where they just, I mean, like if their fourth receiver is Marquez Valdes-Scantling, that's kind of ridiculous, you know? Like he was the number 2 for Green Bay for years, and Green Bay won 13 games multiple times with that. So
I think for the Chiefs, it's more because I mean I hear you, but also they have one of the best offensive lines in the NFL.
that too.
I would
So,
say probably
maybe
even
that's
more so
better.
than the weapons. That's
You're right.
really
That's right. You're right.
probably what made the difference for when they
So-
lacked and he was hurt.
Where I
So,
was going with this, though, is the Bills this offseason, that was their defensive line group. And I think the Von Miller injury, I know like they were still good on the D-line, but I really think that not ruined the identity of this team, but it changed things a lot. And it put a lot more on the shoulders of Allen, not making excuses
Yeah.
for him. But
it used to be the secondary for them.
Yeah, and it's just like when early in the season when they looked so dominant that first like month and a half, it was because they had this pass rush unit that was one of the best 3 units in football, like very clearly. And they just did not have that the last half of the season.
Well, the other thing is that even if that's not your identity, you still need a very consistent pass rusher, I believe. And then the Chiefs have that in Chris Jones, and the Bengals have that in Trey Hendrickson, who's, he doesn't like. Somehow we still just don't talk about him as one of the elite guys, but he has been that for basically 3 straight years now. He is one of the most consistent pressure generators in the NFL, and it's like big moments he's consistently coming up. So even though they don't have, a slew of rushers, he's very good and has been that for them.
He's like Ryan Kerrigan, Hassan Reddick, like really good on third downs when you know that you need to get after the quarterback, and he's very good at converting pressures to sacks, like his very high sack to pressure rate, which is not consistent among all edge players, but there definitely are guys who are bad at getting sacks. Montez Sweat, Brandon Graham, and guys who are really good at getting sacks. Hassan Reddick, Ryan Kerrigan, Trey Hendrickson, So,
Yep.
I mean,
Absolutely.
that's who he is.
And again, health is a big deal for them. The Bengals just keep staying healthy. The Bills, they've had a harder time. They've had injuries to star players over the past couple of years. So, I mean, I don't want to say Tre'Davious White makes the difference last year, but maybe he does. One of the best corners in football.
42 points in the divisional round. I'd like to think it does make a difference.
Right. So, it's tough, but there will be times when they'll go in fully healthy, you would hope. So maybe next year. All right. Last team we're going to talk about. I love how Noah wrote this. They have $223,000 in cap space this year. And
AP
again,
style. That might be AP style. I don't
know. It's funny. They've got a lot of expensive players. They do. So when we're looking at how they can manage their cap space, I have him here as being projected at $5 million over the cap, just on overthecap.com. But whatever the case might be, it's not a lot of available space. Dak Prescott has $31 million base salary, so you can bring him down. Like you can get well cap compliant with just a restructure for him. I know that people are up in arms about his performance, but realistically, like he's gonna be here. You know what I mean? He's gonna be here. He's gonna be your guy, and you can run it back, and you can still have a good year next year. So, I think you're gonna save some money with Ezekiel Elliott probably being released. You can post June 1 him, which is probably the way to do it. And if you do that, you don't generate a ton of space up front, but you ultimately save $10.9 million in the long run. And then DeMarcus Lawrence, I probably wouldn't want to restructure necessarily, just because you probably have to add void years to him, I think, and then you're just pushing the can down the line a little bit. So I just hold off on that because he's still good enough to keep on the roster for sure, but you never know when a drop off will come because he's 30 right now. So, but regardless, like, you can make space, you can make moves, you got picks. They're gonna have to pay. They're probably gonna have to pay Trevon Diggs this offseason, and the reality is, I think another legit playmaker to replace what they lost with Amari Cooper is probably the biggest investment that I would want to make, because Tyron Smith is another guy who, where is Tyron Smith? You can save a fair amount of money with him. Let me see. Tyron Smith. Yeah, you can save money with him. So look, the reality is they played the majority of the season without Tyron Smith. You can let him go. Their situation is actually pretty solid, all things considered. The one thing I do worry about with them is, do they decide to make a move at head coach? Because I would not be surprised, now that we're a couple of days removed from that game, if we do have something come out where they decide that they want to go after Sean Payton. They don't want to miss out on that by waiting. So I know that the Saints wouldn't be hyped to send him in conference, but the reality is that if that's where he wants to go, that for sure they'll pony up the pick and get that done. So that's the one thing to keep in consideration. Other than that, they can run it back with the key guys and make enough. People crack me up. Like, how are the Cowboys going to make any additions? They're not in a place where they can do any. Like, they have a first round pick, they can restructure contracts. They're just fine. So, look, Cowboys are the most polarizing team in the NFL. I think so. It is what it is. But let's be honest, they can be good next year. It's going to be tough to contend with the Eagles for anybody. So if that's your benchmark, then good luck to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's this whole division really too. But I even think, in comparison to Philly, like, I don't think this division's completely doomed, because, and I know you think that they're going to be fine, but I do believe, like, once you pay Jalen Hurts, it's going to change the outlook of that roster just in terms of depth a little bit. So we'll see. I mean, I expect that this might be as good as that roster gets in Philadelphia. That could be easily proven wrong by how Howie Roseman goes about things, but they might be less world beater type going forward and more just of a very, very good football team, which I do think there's a difference between the two things, but we'll see.
But the thing you just have to keep in mind is the way that extensions work, it depends on what you want to do, but there's really no reason that his cap hit has to go up this year. So usually for a player like him, where he's a second round pick and he's going into his fourth year, if you extend him this year, probably still has a low cap hit, and then it's going to start going up in future years. But you've also protected yourself a little bit, because you've made a lot of first round picks over the past couple of years, especially this year. They're going to have two.
Yeah, two more. Yeah.
Yeah. So
next
they're going to have
be quite good again still. Yes.
Next year and probably the year after that. I mean, you have to assume that some of these guys, like, Jordan Davis and Cam Jurgens and a couple of those other guys, are going to work out, as well as the picks that they'll make this year. But really, there's no reason for that roster to fall off in the near future, because they've balanced expensive players with young high investments.
Yes. So I do think there will be a drop off most times from Fletcher Cox to Jordan Davis, and from Jason Kelsey to Cam Jurgens, and
there probably will be, and there also will probably be a drop off from James Bradbury to whatever corner is going to be in there. So it will be for sure, but I think they've just positioned themselves as well as you possibly could. Right? That's all. I think that's the way that I would phrase it. But
we got Cowboys breaking news, by the way.
What's that?
Jets are hiring former Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett as their offensive coordinator, per source.
It makes sense, because Aaron Rodgers.
Aaron Rodgers is going to beat the quarterback in the New York Jets. Yeah.
Here's the thing. Look, I don't want to devolve into that because I want to talk about it in a few minutes.
Yeah.
So we'll circle back to that news.
Yeah.
But there's a few things. The game management was awful.
Mm-hmm.
Russell Wilson was atrocious.
Yeah.
And I told you a long time ago that I thought Russell Wilson was washed. And you were like, I don't know. I think I think at this point, like we kind of all agree that that's a reality.
I think the offense didn't fit his strengths too, but I think he's definitely worse than he was. That's for sure. He's not an elite quarterback anymore.
But Hackett was the offensive coordinator for the Packers, and Mike LaFleur, Matt LaFleur is best friends with Robert Saleh. They've been best friends since college. They communicate on a daily basis. Mike LaFleur, younger brother, specifically because of that relationship, was the Jets offensive coordinator. So it's like, if there's anybody who has as much intimate knowledge of how he is as an offensive coordinator, it would be Robert Saleh, right? So it's I think game management wise, you take that out of his hands, and it might not be as bad as some people are thinking. So look, I kind of, maybe I just mentally prepared myself for the possibility of this, but I'm not going to react to it as negatively because it was a total disaster in Denver in a myriad of ways. But a lot of things happened to get to that point. Javonte Williams getting hurt, Garrett Ball's getting hurt, Russell Wilson getting hurt and being terrible. I mean,
people forget this team beat the Niners in week 3, straight up, like they did.
Yeah, I just, I know it was bad, but let's not pretend that this coach didn't become an offensive coordinator by some level of merit before this. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Just pump the brakes on all the memes and stuff. But obviously, me saying that's not going to stop it from happening. But look, also Aaron Rodgers. So we'll see what happens with that. Anything else on the Cowboys before we move on to what was intended to be the main topic here today?
Yeah, I think you hit on what their main improvements need to be. I think they need more wide receiver help. I think that releasing Cooper and expecting to get something out of Jalen Tolbert, remember him, year 1, to replace.
And Gallup coming off an injury too, late season injury.
People were saying Tolbert's got to replace wide receiver 3, and I was like, no, you're replacing Amari Cooper, and you need to hope some amalgamation of Lamb increasing his output, which did happen.
Cedric Wilson walked too.
And Cedric Wilson walked. Yeah, Noah Brown was decent for them, but yeah, it wasn't great there. And I think Dalton Schultz is good chance he doesn't come back. I think Jake Ferguson's good, so I don't know that they're actually going to struggle there. But there's some I don't want to say red flags, but there's some concerns of the direction of the team, because I think their offensive line, although it was better than I expected this year, it got worse, and they're getting older still at other positions. It's still a good unit, and you could reinforce it and make sure it stays good, but they need to do that. And then defensively, they were kind of similar this year than they were last year. A really good explosive pass rush that made big plays. The defense was able to force some turnovers in the back end. The secondary had its open. You could expose it if you had the right game plan, the right personnel. They're probably going to need to find more pieces for the secondary as well to upgrade. Probably need more defensive tackle help. There are places on this roster you can upgrade for sure. And I think it becomes even more important, not as a saying Dak Prescott's not their quarterback going forwards. I think he's still quite good, but just showing that he does have some limitations. He's not a Patrick Mahomes type talent. You're going to need to surround him with as much as you can to try and ultimately get to a Super Bowl, which I think they can, but it's just they have to do diligence at every corner of this roster if they can.
Agreed. All right. So got our breaking news. We can include that in a series of a couple of comments we can make briefly. Jim Schwartz, we talked about before, hired as Browns defensive coordinator. Makes a lot of sense. Defensive line was pretty disappointing for them this year, as good as Myles Garrett is overall. I think Jim Schwartz is going to come in and fix that. And the back end will probably be more well coached as well. But that I think their priority is the defensive line, and his system is going to get the most out of those guys, especially from a pass rushing perspective. Bill O'Brien, hired as Patriots offensive coordinator. We knew this was going to happen. We knew it. You know what I mean? It wasn't official, but I had already assumed that this was going to be the case. It makes too much sense from just the way that the Patriots operate. So do you have a couple of comments on either one of those before we jump into the head coach rankings?
We already touched on Schwartz a little bit. I think it's a good hire. I think it's just, an aggressive defensive hire for a team who needs to upgrade there. And Bill O'Brien, we kind of expected, I think we almost could have penciled that one in, really. It's not a wildly innovative hire from the Patriots, which is kind of expected at this point from them. But I don't know. I don't know what they're – I tweeted after this hire, I don't know what their ceiling is. I don't think it's great. I think this makes them like a team that can make the playoffs with a couple moves. And funny enough, what I tweeted was they should really be a team that should goes and tries to trade for DeAndre Hopkins because they need like that over the top weapon. And then I realized that with Bill O'Brien being there now, I don't know how likely it is that he's going to want to play for the Patriots. So I don't know. They really need they're missing a clear dominant unit. It's kind of their pass rush meshed with their man coverage scheme on the back end defensively, but it's just, I don't know. If you're a defensive team, you kind of need the quarterback play to back it up. And I'm not certain Mac Jones on his own is good enough to really elevate this roster to a point where they can compete for a Super Bowl. They're in a weird spot, really. They're good. They're just good. That's the problem, is they're not exceptional at anything.
No, here's the thing. I actually think that this is a good hire for them.
I do. I agree.
Because he was the offensive coordinator for the Patriots in 2011, which was a very good year for Brady. I believe that was a Super Bowl loss here, but a very good season statistically. And lost to the Giants. Then he went to Penn State and made Christian Hackenberg look good, if y'all recall that. Then he went to the Texans, and he was the head coach from 2014 through 2020. Let me just pull this up here just so that I can double check myself. Texans. I should have done this beforehand, but I just want. So who was their quarterback at the time? I'm trying to remember. So Case Keenum, Tom Savage were the guys that they were playing. They made it to the playoffs in the following year with Brian Hoyer and Brandon Whedon. They made it to the playoffs the following year in 2016 with Brock Osweiler and Brandon Whedon. And they did not qualify for the playoffs in Deshaun Watson's first year, although he had a very good rookie season before getting hurt. And then back into the playoffs again with Deshaun Watson. So he's gotten a fair amount out of quarterbacks, and has a pretty good track record of getting the most out of them. So I mean, I like this for Mac Jones. I really do, to be perfectly honest. This is a world away from whatever nonsense secret plan they had at offensive coordinator last year for a second-year quarterback. This is a guy with a proven track record who, despite whatever personality issues you might have with him, is probably fits in perfectly well with the tenor of what's already there. And I expect this to actually work out for them. Now, they do need to make some moves personnel-wise, but ultimately, I don't think this is something that that I would dunk on. I think that this is actually a good move.
Yeah. Well, and considering where they were as well offensively, just getting back to what they do well, I think is really important, because look, this was a good team 2 years ago. They won 10 games. For a while, they were in discussion for even the number one seed in the AFC. They had a great start. We saw the limitations of the offense because of lack of weapons. I think if they invest there with this upgrade, maybe they get back to that position, and who knows? I mean, I think there's still a team that has to win lower scoring games, but Belichick has shown the ability to do that in his career. And I'll never doubt him because clearly, like, they have, despite not changing a lot schematically, strategically, like, they continue to be, at the very least, like a competitive football team. And this is going to give them even more of that floor. And because of that, I think it's solid. Not like there will not be questions about the direction of this offense next year, at the very least, no matter what happens.
Yeah, and let's not forget about Bryce Young, who he just helped develop as well,
Mm-hmm.
who, we basically consider to have hit the peak of his possible potential as a college player. I mean, that's the way that I view it. I'm not sure what more you could expect from a guy. Jim, do you agree with that? Or
yeah.
All right. So those are just some of the coordinator movements that we've had over the past couple of weeks / days. And now let's get into our ranking for the head coach openings. So none have been filled yet. The pacing of hiring a head coach has slowed down over the past couple of years. I think teams are realizing that they should not rush into hiring a coach just to be the first one to have one, because some of the earliest hires throughout history over the past 10 years or so have often been the worst ones, or the ones that have worked out the least well. And so taking the time to actually interview a number of candidates and feel comfortable with guys who maybe are doing exceptionally well deeper in the playoffs and considering them instead of not wanting to wait around. That's sort of a mentality shift that's happened over this past year. So we have, let's see, I think I'm going to put that.
Do we want to go back and forth like 5-5, 4-4? Or do we want to just do it all at once? Or
well, what I think is that so that we can talk about each one in depth.
Mm-hmm.
I'll pull up, because I have graphics here and like I don't want to bounce back and forth between them. So I'll pull up the first one and then you'll say where they are on your ranking and I'll say where they are on my ranking. Okay. All right. So the first one we're going to talk about here is the Indianapolis Colts. And for me personally, when I look at how desirable a head coach job is, there are a number of things that come into play, right? The quarterback situation, that's important. Cap space and draft picks for available improvements. The current core of star players, and I generally consider those guys to be anyone who is in their 20s to very early 30s, who's going to be around and plays at a very high level, will be around for more than just one more year. So even if that player ultimately becomes a trade asset or stays, either way, that's something. And then I look at ownership and what their tendencies have been in terms of how quickly they pull the plug, how much do they interfere, how frustrating are they, and then who is the GM and how desirable is he to work with? What kind of reputation does he have around the NFL? So as we look through those specific categories, and then Nick, you include anything else you want to at the end, they have Matt Ryan, who is their number one quarterback under contract right now. Kind of believe they want to move on from that. Obviously, they've got about $13 million in space. They've got the 4th overall pick, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 2 7s. And their core stars are Jonathan Taylor, Quentin Nelson, Michael Pittman Jr., DeForest Buckner, Shaq Leonard. And then I would say those are the stars. They have a smattering of other good to quite good players. Ownership is Jim Irsay, and GM is Chris Ballard. So, Chris Ballard is generally highly regarded around the league. Jim Irsay is generally considered, I think, a frustrating owner from fan perspective, but a fairly solid owner from coaching and GM perspective. I think, he might pressure from time to time, but the reality is I think he just wants to win. So I don't come down as hard on him as probably fans might. So looking at those and any other qualifications or categories you want to, where do you rank the Colts in terms of how desirable their head coaching job is?
Yeah, so this is my number 2 job, and I think it's actually a pretty good situation for anyone to end up. I think it's tough that a lot of their star players are of lesser positional value in terms of like guard, running back, linebacker. But they've shown the ability to draft pretty well. I don't think it's an exceptional drafting team, but I think they're good. There's no real concern here with me with the general manager being gone anytime soon. I know Ballard maybe has been here for a while and they haven't won a whole lot, but it seems like Irsay and Ballard work pretty well together. I would expect that that's like pretty sustained organizationally. And look, the thing with Irsay is it's just kind of messy sometimes, but ultimately, like this year, like people give him a lot of crap for like what happened, and maybe I wasn't a fan of firing Frank Wright. I thought he was a good coach, but ultimately, like this guy said we need a quarterback and went out of his way to make sure that they would tank their way to getting one of these top quarterbacks. And as like messy as that can be, maybe from a player or coaching standpoint, like organizationally, like they're going to be much better off because they decided to do this, and maybe some other organizations should maybe do this more often. But Irsay's been here before in terms of acquiring top quarterbacks. He knows what it takes. He knows how valuable these top picks can be. And you're in a spot here where if you come in as a head coach, you can help this team decide, especially because of where they're picking, 4th overall, not hard to manipulate your way to get your choice of a quarterback, what quarterback you bring in and develop. And I think that's extremely powerful from a head coaching standpoint to be able to be a part of that selection process, as well as a roster that I think you can manipulate to be better. You have some pieces to work with already. This is a stable, I don't want to say high floor, but like most times I would expect you not to have a disaster start here. You're going to have some time because you're going to be developing your quarterback. And ultimately, I think most coaches really would like to be able to be a part of that quarterback selection process. And they get to here. I mean, it's a little limited when you think about it. It's got to be a younger guy. It's got to be a rookie. But I think that this is not a team that I look at and don't think in 2 years they can't be a playoff team and maybe for a consistent number of years continue to be a playoff team.
So for many of the same reasons, this is my number 3 job. And the only reason it's not higher is because you will always be limited financially the way they do things there. And so it's always going to be just that much harder to build and then maintain a roster. So some of the teams that cycle through players by drafting them and then letting them walk into free agency and then continuing to draft, some of the teams that do that by philosophy, they kind of have to do it by mentality. And yes, they are willing to retain some of the star players. We've seen that. They've retained Quentin Nelson and Braden Smith. And Braden Smith is probably a player that I should have put under their core stars, but he had kind of a down year. So I that's probably a snub. I should probably include him. But or Shaq Leonard. But a lot of the other guys along the way are usually let go. So it's really just the most impactful players that are retained, and they don't really generally get into free agency. So anytime you improve your team, you usually have to rely on the draft for that. And that's a tough way to operate, especially if you don't have a quarterback. It doesn't let you go BPA as often either. We saw that from them this year. They were like, these are players that we need, so we have to spend a 2nd-round pick on a wide receiver. And even though he was pretty good, they didn't really have an option to go elsewhere. We have to spend our 3rd-round pick on the left tackle. You know what I mean? And even though teams do that sometimes, they don't really have that much of a choice. So I think that is the one thing that would really hold me back about this at all. But overall, you look at the defense, it's pretty solid. They've got good players, and they have enough there that a quarterback could come in and maybe not instantly turn things around, but probably have a solid place to develop. So this is my number 3 option, or my 3rd ranking situation for a head coach coming in. Any other thoughts on the Colts based on what I've
said? My hot take here is like with the right coaching, if this team gets Bryce Young, I think they can win a playoff game next year.
I think it's fair. I mean, they've got to fix the left tackle position.
Yeah, they do.
They just have to.
But I mean, I think across the board, their line played poorly this year, and I think that was a bit coaching as well. I think outside of Frank Reich, like the staff was not maybe as excellent person per person as we had come to think, just because of how good I think Frank Reich was a little bit. But it's not a terrible roster. Like there's a reason a lot of people picked them to win the division, including me. If they added Derek Carr this offseason, like people would be picking them probably to be a wild card team, right? Or I don't know that I would, but I think other people would be, they're not. This isn't like a disaster roster wise, like some of the other teams they're picking as high as they are. Like they clearly phoned it in a little bit and are picking high because they started Sam Ehlinger for a number of games. They started Nick Foles for a number of games. They hired their ex-center to coach the team for 3/4 of a season. Like it's just, I think that's the weird thing, by the way, like that I don't really know how to factor into this whole discussion is if Jeff Saturday ends up being their head coach. I don't know what this looks like. I'm not particularly high on that, but
I kind of doubt that's actually going to happen. I think they're giving him an interview because, you should. But I don't think that's ultimately the way this shakes out. I think Jim Irsay is a little all over the place, but I don't think he's done anything like that's been an abject disaster or like some absolute idiocy. Like we talked about hiring Jeff Saturday at the time, and I said, look, firing Frank Reich aside, what is the worst possible outcome for hiring him versus the best possible outcome for hiring some other person as the interim head coach, right? Like they were already essentially well out of the playoffs. And so what you know what I mean? What is it that's actually wrong with that decision? So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a solid place to want to be, and obviously these will all get filled, but I think there are other places that are more desirable for specific reasons, which we'll get to. But I also don't think this is something where you're like, I don't know if I want to get myself into that. All right. Next up, let's go with where is it? There it is. Okay. We're going to go with the Arizona Cardinals. All right. So with the same categories that I talked about before, their number one quarterback who's currently on the roster is Kyler Murray. So you would certainly expect him to be the guy going forward. He is hurt, so that comes into play as well. You've got to kind of believe in your ability to revitalize his career and believe that you can get the most out of him as a player and as a leader. They have about $14 million in cap space, so not a ton, but not nothing. They have the third overall pick, a 2, 2 3s, a 4, a 5, a 6, and a 6. Core stars would be Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, Hollywood Brown, Budda Baker, and that's kind of all I could come up with stars. So the roster itself is lacking. Michael Bidwell is the owner. He is shown to have been generally quite loyal. There is the example of Wilkes being fired after just 1 year. Back after the 2018 season, which never really looks good, but they gave Cliff Kingsbury a pretty good run. He has overall been very loyal to his executive employees, and new GM Monty Ossenfort has come over. So we don't know that much about him. He's a name that I've heard prior to this year, but I would be lying if I said that I have any real insight to what his philosophies are or his mentalities are. He's John Robinson, who was the Titans GM, was an ex-Patriots executive, and he's come up largely under John Robinson. So there is probably some of that mentality in there as well. For sure, he's his own unique person too, but we have to see in terms of what kind of players he's going to go after. How they want to allocate resources. So that's all up in the air. So if you have a prior relationship with him, probably helps a little bit, but in terms of track record, not a lot to go on. So where would you put the Cardinals in your ranking?
So this is my top job, and there's a couple of things here.
Okay.
First of all, I was very impressed by Monty Austinfort in his first introductory press conference. Now, I know that doesn't mean everything, but I think in terms of his discussion of how to use resources currently in the league today, how to leverage analytics in terms of making decisions, positional value, things like that, he just came off across as up to date, which I think is the baseline of what you want out of GM these days. And there's definitely a lot of teams that aren't quite up to date with that type of thing. For example, my Washington Commanders. So that's like baseline, like number one. Number two, I believe in Kyler Murray. Like, I think he is a very good quarterback who has had stunted development. And I think despite stunted development is still in the 8 to 12 range of quarterbacks with Dak, Kirk, Jalen Hurts, in my opinion, of like where he is talented currently with what he's been dealt with in terms of talent and coaching and scheme and all that. And then on top of that, he has this injury. So if you get this job and you're like, all right, I'm here to develop Kyler Murray, you're kind of guaranteed 2 seasons. Like, you kind of get like a pass year one. We're just developing the roster. We need to fill a lot of holes with our resources this offseason. You're going to kind of develop the culture, see how Kyler is when he gets back, fit him into the scheme. And then next year we'll really see what you can do with Kyler Murray, right? And as long as you don't like look like Nathaniel Hackett, like, you're probably going to be back. So I think there's those 3 things going here are really excellent. You're probably going to get a blue chip prospect in either Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, which is another like really important thing, I think, for a new coach to like just have like a top pass rusher and quarterback immediately as you get here. And I think the pressure to succeed early doesn't exist as much. And I think when you have that quarterback and you can just develop this roster piece by piece, just look for the best players at valuable positions, it's a really good place to be for an organization. I think this organization has seen the ability long-term to succeed under Bidwell. They just kind of stuck with the same GM, I think, probably for a little too long with Kime, but there were some very successful years there when they had Carson Palmer, Larry Fitzgerald, some of these other players. Defensively, they had Chandler Jones, Calais Campbell. Like, they've been capable of finding talent. And then, culturally building
but the majority of the guys have all been free agents, right?
Yes.
And I know it's a different GM, but
the idea is because it's a different GM, like, it doesn't matter how you acquire it. The point is, like, they aren't gonna top down have organizational issues. So they get good players, like, they should win games. We've seen that with this organization. Whereas like there are other teams where they will have good players and not win because their culture is a problem. And I think unlike what you're looking at with a rookie quarterback, unlike what you're looking at with some of these teams where you have to just kind of deal with the quarterback that they have already, this is a team where I feel comfortable that with the right players, this is a Super Bowl contender because I think Kyler Murray has that elite quarterback ceiling.
So, all right. I struggle with this one a little bit because I just wasn't sure to slot it in either as my last ranked job or my second to last ranked job. So okay. I settled on second to last, but the reason for it is you have to be in on Kyler Murray. Otherwise, this becomes pretty unappealing pretty quickly. Because even though you might have some built-in longevity, you're probably not going to be very good at all in your first year. And as easy as that sounds to deal with now, when you go in, you're like, okay, yeah, we know things aren't going to be that good. All right, well, if you have a really brutally rough season your first year, and then Kyler Murray comes back and he's like, okay, we're like, okay, but you're going to now, a season from now, he's going to be more well-recovered, ready to play better. Well, then you're basically locked into a year with a backup quarterback for at least a portion of the year. You're guaranteed that. And then guaranteed a year with Kyler Murray. Because he would have to be a total disaster for them to move on from him after just one season. So you're locked into probably a bad season without Murray for at least part of it. And then another season with him. And you basically know that now. We talked about the core stars, and they've got a couple of guys. They need to fully rebuild the offensive line. they're probably going to trade DeAndre Hopkins. They might trade back. Yeah, they might get a blue chip prospect, or would you rather trade back and get picks? Because this roster is basically not a lot going on with it. And so then if you don't, then you don't have the blue chip. For me, I'm not saying that, you just refuse the job, but it's like my perspective on it is a lot less appealing. If you add, let's just say you add the first, the second, and the 2/3, and all those guys are probably going to have to contribute. So you get a defensive lineman, and then I guess with your second round pick, I don't know, maybe you draft a corner, and then you try and build some offensive line depth, but you've got to find out who's going to be playing guard, center, guard, tackle, because Kelvin Beachum is at this point probably shouldn't be playing as a starter anymore. DJ Humphries is your best lineman. Rodney Hudson, I guess maybe he comes back, but he's pretty old at this point. So it's like a pretty extensive rebuild job. And you've really got to believe in the GM that you're pairing up with, if that's the case, because almost the entire roster is going to be, reimagined. And because Austin Fort was just hired, he's going to have a lot of input on it. This is not a place where you walk in and you're like, these are the kinds of guys that I want. I want this player, and even though that might be better in some ways from a head coaching perspective, usually you want to know that your input is going to be taken seriously, and that's not always the case with GMs. Even if they say that, sometimes it's a little bit more about their guys. So it's really, again, it comes down to how much do you believe in Monty Austin Fort, what kind of relationship you have with him, and how much do you believe in Kyler Murray. Because personally, I'm pretty reserved on Murray, and I don't like the idea that I'm locked into him for 2 years, because then if 2 years go badly, yeah, you might get your third year to find a new quarterback, but look, if you don't have a good year with a rookie, then you're out the door. That's just that's my take on it. So not that I'd turn it down, but if I could get one of the others that I have ranked higher, I would take them.
Yeah, I mean, this is the difference between us, just the belief in the quarterback and the GM. And I think I know the ACL might limit his mobility. I don't think he needs to be a running first quarterback to succeed in this league. I think he has the accuracy, the arm talent. I think to an extent, the processing, and maybe needs a little bit of a jump up, but I don't think he's a terrible decision maker. He had that one playoff game that was horrible, and I think a lot of people roasted him for that. But I think across history, there's any number of quarterbacks who in their first playoff game have been awful. So it's not really that surprising. I don't know. I think you can make it work with him more so than he already has been. I think we've seen him play at an MVP level. Like it's happened. It's just, I don't, from the start, there were signs of Cliff not being the guy maybe to make this work. Although I think Cliff is like a decent offensive coordinator. I don't know how much his hirings really improved the rest of the team. And then the scheme was just a little too collegey, quite frankly, to work consistently at the NFL level. And then I do think it kind of got stale with Steve Keim. They had we've gone over their drafts. Like it's not been fantastic. And I think Austin Fort is at the very least going to be an upgrade for them in terms of drafting. I don't know. I think year one here, like you get to come in and you get to really focus individually on players and their development. And that's intriguing because if you can do that correctly and you can get flashes from players, you can win 5 games and it can still be positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I get it. I think that you can look at either of them optimistically. I think you can look at any of these jobs optimistically. In fact, somebody's going to talk themselves into all of them at some point. But yeah, I would be reserved. I just don't like anything where I'm locked into something I'm not pretty darn sure of. So that's really what it comes down to.
I mean, all of these are that to some extent.
Yeah, but I think some of these you're really not locked in, right? So like for Indy, what are you locked into? Whichever quarterback you decide you want to take.
If you draft the wrong quarterback and it sucks year one, you might just be out the door. Like I guess that's fine.
Look, that's very unusual. Like it's very unusual to be fired with a with a poor rookie performance.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't see like what the big difference. I mean, I guess you're on a rookie contract on a quarterback, so you can add more to the roster. But if you're the Colts, like we know that they don't spend a lot in free agency, so does it really make a big difference?
But also the roster is notably better as well.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So they're my number 4. I'm going to throw it to you now. Who do you want to do next?
Let's do Carolina because I think that there are a lot of similarities between that job and Indianapolis.
Okay. All right. The Carolina Panthers, their best quarterback currently slated to be on the roster is Jacob Eason. They've got negative $8 million in cap space. They have the 9th pick, 2 2s, a 3, 2 4s, and a 5. They've got Ike Ekwonu, DJ Moore, Taylor Moton, Brian Burns, Derek Brown, Shaq Thompson, maybe debatable at this point, but had a pretty solid year. JC Horn and Jeremy Chin. David Tepper, he's a relatively new owner. He's only had one head coach so far, which was Matt Rule, who had about 2.5 years. And Scott Fitterer is the GM, so who was hired partway through the tenure of Matt Rule. So just looking at that, the cap space could be better, but they can make moves to free up some cap space. They'll probably move on from Shaq Thompson. Wouldn't be surprised. So I put him in here, but I'm not sure if that's going to stick. They're pretty well set at the tackle spots. Their overall offensive line is pretty good. JC Horn is good corner. Jeremy Chin's a very good defensive back. The owner is aggressive. The owner wants a quarterback. So really, this comes down to how much sway do you think you can have over the owner's decision about which quarterback you go after? Because if you believe in your interview with him, you're like, okay, he wants a quarterback, but he's willing to go with whoever I think is the most important guy or the best option for us. I feel pretty good about that. I feel like he's already got his mindset on somebody. Maybe you worry about that a little bit. They have a nice slew of draft picks because of the Christian McCaffrey trade. They would have more if they didn't keep spending them on quarterbacks who are not going to be on the roster. I guess Matt Corral technically could be their quarterback one right now, but regardless, either way, it doesn't look really good. Again, cap space you can work with. They have enough good players that you don't have to freak out about trying to add pieces, and you have plenty of draft picks, and you probably have a little time as a new head coach. So where do you rank this?
So this is my 3rd job, and there's a couple things here. This roster is the best roster, probably debatably like with Denver, I guess, in terms of outside quarterback that we're going to talk about, which is great. Like that's a nice high ceiling. The issue with that is because they're so good roster-wise, I think you get one shot at your quarterback. Even if, and I guess it doesn't really matter from a coaching standpoint because you're probably only going to get one shot at quarterback anyways. It's because you're probably going to be drafting a guy high. So let's actually just forget that point. But the things that kind of turn me away from this job are I think David Tepper has a little more control over this quarterback selection process than I would have liked. I have not been a fan of many of the quarterback moves they've made in past years. Even though I liked Matt Corral, I thought moving up for him was kind of ridiculous with how few picks they had and where their roster was at the time. I think trading for Sam Darnold as much as they gave up was kind of ridiculous at the time as well. And then I think they've had other opportunities to draft quarterbacks, like when Justin Fields was on the board, when Mac Jones was on the board, and they didn't, although JC Horn's great, they didn't take their opportunities there either. And that was, they kind of just went with Sam Darnold and said, we're good. So I'm not thrilled by that. And that kind of goes along with the GM. And another problem with this is one thing I really am a fan of, and you kind of get that with Arizona, is I think organizational, like structural flow of how things come in and come out really matters to success. I want my GM, my coach, and my new quarterback kind of all arriving at the same time. I do not like the idea of arriving, being on a team where the GM and owner are picking a quarterback, and there's a chance that my GM is not here next year if we don't succeed, because he's already been here for a few years. He's been a pretty good drafter, honestly, but if we don't win, I don't know how certain I am that he's going to be back again next year. And then you're working with a new GM and things are different. And if the quarterback didn't work, what process is that new GM going to work by? Do they even like the current quarterback I have, even if I like that quarterback? So there's all these the question marks with that. And then the last thing that kind of makes it a little worse is that they're picking 9th, and they're not guaranteed to get their selection of the quarterback they want. They're probably going to have to put picks into it to trade up, which I'm not thrilled by either. Like, I kind of want to have like more talent if I'm not getting my selection of the top quarterbacks. I think a lot of the quarterbacks in this draft probably at that point are going to need a year before they can really play. And I'll be honest with you, like, I think there's a clear tier and difference between like the Strouds and Bryce Youngs of the world and the Will Levises and Anthony Richardsons. And I don't know how thrilled I am by having to not necessarily, you're not settling for one of those guys. Like, obviously both of those guys can end up being very good quarterbacks. It's just the option is limited kind of to that. Like, I have to be all in on those guys. And I'm not certain with all these organizational questions that I would be as thrilled by that.
So I get that. I hear you on that. This is my top ranked job available. So I love the roster that they have in place. I love that it's ready to compete right now outside of the quarterback, because that gives your quarterback the best possible opportunity for development. That's a really big deal to me. You have an offensive line. You would assume they will have a running game, even though the coaching staff may be different. They will still probably be able to run the ball effectively based on who they have. The drafting has been pretty good, and the moves that they've made for quarterbacks, I believe, were largely influenced by Matt Rule. Matt Rule had a big-time contract and a lot of influence over the roster, more so than I think Scott Fitterer ultimately, and that Tepper felt like he needed to do that to get him out of college and secure him as the coach. Ultimately, I think that's kind of a bad decision, because what it takes to assemble a college roster and an NFL roster are very different. And even if you can learn that, you can't expect to just know that coming in. So there really should be somebody to offset that if you want to go the college coach route. I think there should be someone to offset it, even if you're an NFL coach. But, that depends on who the coach is, probably. But the roster is well set at key positions: tackle, playmaker, corner, pass rusher. The hardest positions to get, the most impactful to get outside of quarterback. And you have a top 10 pick and someone who's willing to go get who you want to. So whether that is a Lamar Jackson, whether that is a player in the draft, do I think there is a possibility that they can be more aggressive than the Colts and go up to 1 and get Bryce Young? 100%. Why not? So I hear you on the ownership being a little bit maybe more influential than you would like, but amid all that other stuff, you also, and this isn't something I always necessarily consider, but this division is very winnable, and it's just, if I'm picking a quarterback and I have a feeling I can go get my guy, and I feel like I have a situation where he can develop effectively, that's as much as you can possibly ask for a team that doesn't already have a quarterback set. So that's why this is my top job.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I ever said, but this is my number 3 job, so I have it right behind the Colts. I debated whether I put it 2 or 3. You made some good points. I might even I've been going back and forth between having those 2 and 3. But yeah, I mean, the Matt Rule thing is like, again, I don't trust the ownership, and that was their decision. Like, they decided to give him all that money and bring him in and make him as a college.
It was also his first year on the job as owner. I will say that too.
Yeah, but we have seen signs of first-year owners messing up, leading to long-term owners consistently messing up. Like, this guy has been a part of ownership groups. Like, he's not new to this game. He was with the Steelers, who like a good organization. Like, I would expect you to kind of have an idea of like what's a good decision for a head coaching hire, and dumping money on a college guy who doesn't know how to make roster decisions and then letting him do that is not great. And I'm not thrilled by it. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe whoever comes in as a head coach gets to make that decision at quarterback, and ultimately like they're in a great spot. But I wouldn't feel personally, if I were in this hiring process, that I don't know, maybe it changes through an interview. Maybe I figure out that I actually am a part of that process, but I don't think whoever gets hired here is going to have a lot of discussion into which quarterback they go after.
I tend to disagree with that, but let me just give you a hypothetical. How appealing does this job become if you know that they would be willing to trade a package to go up to number 1 and get Bryce Young?
I don't know what that package is. I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, so the question is like how. I mean, it's probably better than Indy in that case. Like again, like ultimately for me, I feel very safe with Kyler Murray personally. Like I think he's at the very least a franchise quarterback, and I think that just like the difference between what you need to add for that roster to compete at a high level and like where Carolina is currently roster wise is large. Cause I think the Panthers have way more talent than Kansas City does. Doesn't matter. Now I know Mahomes is like its own thing, but I believe we have seen Kyler Murray play at a level where I think it's possible that he could be a top 5 quarterback in a given year. And although I love Bryce Young, I think he's great. Like we grade quarterbacks on the idea of can he be your franchise guy? Like if Bryce Young ends up being as good as Dak, like you hit on that pick because it's very hard to find a Dak, you know? So I just think it's that important to like have that outcome at quarterback. And if I think there's a better possibility with Kyler, like that's going to sway me. And I do believe that. So,
okay.
But that's me. I just think Kyler's like, I probably had Kyler as a similar ranking as Bryce Young coming out as prospects right behind. I would have had Lawrence as like my top prospect over the past 6 years. Burrow is number 2. And then it would have been like Kyler and Bryce Young are right there at like 3 and 4, maybe with Justin Fields in that realm as well. And you can see the difference coming into the league between like even Fields and Kyler, like how instantly Kyler worked despite really not having much talent when he first got there in Arizona either.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. I get it. I like this spot. I really do. If I was a coach, I'd be very intrigued by going there, especially, as a first time guy. But just because like it's you have cachet as a vet guy sometimes where it's like if the roster is not great, like you kind of know what the process is to rebuild that. If you're a first time guy, sometimes it's nice to walk in and have like high quality players there already. Because then you don't have to worry about the team building as much as the coaching itself. But all right, so let's do Houston next. Houston Texans, Davis Mills, $40 million in cap space, which they will probably use to sign $41 million guys. They have the 2nd and 12th pick, a bunch more picks that are rolling by the screen too fast for me. They've got Brandon Cooks, Damian Pierce, Laramie Tunsil, Derek Stingley Jr., Jalen Petrie are all either stars or major upward arrows. Draft picks, like I said, they're 2nd overall, 12th overall, 2 3s, 4 5, 4 6s, and a 7. Then Cal McNair is the owner, and Nick Caserio is the GM. They have been one of the pinnacles of dysfunction from an ownership and front office standpoint, cycling through GMs and coaches on a very regular basis. Even after a sustained run from Bill O'Brien, they end up giving him too much authority with GM role as well. Then they have to send him out the door partway through the season. Then they have, by all accounts, like a totally toxic personality be the interim GM. And they hire Nick Caserio. And from a head coaching perspective, it's David Culley out the door. Lovie Smith, 1 year out the door. And then Nick Caserio, I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, I don't really see, I know they were in a bad cap situation when he first got there, but I don't really see anything from this roster assembly that's like, great job. Like these guys are like, you've developed core players going forward. Their best player is Laramie Tunsil, who was there before he got there. Damian Pierce is a nice player. I don't think he's a superstar truly, though. He's probably going to be a top 10 type of running back for the duration of his rookie contract. Stingley could be very good, or he could be injury prone throughout his career. And Jalen Petrie is a nice pick. But where else is there a guy where you're like, this is a foundational part of a good roster? And then you've just got all these guys with very little financial investment, and like your GM's probably on the hot seat at this point. So maybe I'm kind of coloring or revealing my placement of this a little bit too early. But where would you put the Texans' vacancy in your ranking?
But this is dead last for me. Yeah, this is like hitting like all the checks of like things I don't want. The one thing they have is resources in the draft and cap space, and that's nice, but I'm not the GM here. I'm the head coach, so that's not the top of my priority list. We don't have a quarterback. We have some young pieces, but ultimately, like, this is one of the worst rosters in the NFL still, and we're hoping it develops. My GM might not be here next year. Continuity gone. We've seen them fire a bunch of coaches in the past, more continuity question marks. And not only is ownership dysfunctional just organizationally, but you had the whole Deshaun Watson saga, which we've heard like cover up type stuff going on there. So I'm not sure I trust their like moral judgment either. Like there's just a lot going on here. This would be like, I mean, I guess if I were, trying to make a break as a head coach, it would be tough to like turn down any head coaching job, but this is as close as I would get to just like blacklisting a job, quite frankly.
I think this is something I would consider, because if you have a coaching opportunity that you take and it doesn't go well, we've seen coaches get second opportunities. This is the kind of place where it might be such a disaster that you're never really considered again. So you really got to have a lot of faith in yourself. And I would frankly, and we've seen this, I think there is a reason that they went with David Culley and Lovie Smith. Lovie Smith is one of the few coaches who didn't ever like have unmitigated success that has gotten this many coaching opportunities. I mean, how many guys get 3 head coaching jobs? Like Bill Parcells? Who else? Some of the guys from like the 70s and 80s, they bounced around, and but this is bad luck. It's a bad look for so many reasons. They couldn't even manage to get the first overall pick despite an entire season of sucking horribly. And now maybe you're a CJ Stroud guy.
By the way, like rumors, another thing that came from dysfunction, because Lovie Smith knew he was on the way out a while ago, and people think that he just like won the game to make sure they wouldn't get it as like a final like suck it type thing. Like,
Yeah.
So it just, there's a lot here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, like that's probably what I would do. It's like, if you hired, and he was a DC under David Culley, so it's like obviously there is a relationship there. So, yeah, it's nice that you gave me probably a somewhat guaranteed contract if you're Lovie Smith, but you're also like, you screwed my guy, now you screwed me. So, what do you think he's telling other coaches around the NFL? So, I mean, I think if you're gonna do this, you probably should have just retained David Culley for another year and just either been pleasantly surprised, been like, okay, we gave you 2 years, let's move on now. But I don't know who they thought they were going to go after, who was going to go there. But it just seems like a mess. And it's like, I haven't been impressed by Nick Caserio anyway. So whether or not, he looks like a villain. I mean, I'm not sure if that really has anything to do with anything, but he looks like a movie villain.
Yeah, but it reminds me of, they got rid of the other guy who I forget his name, but Easterby, whatever. And he was, like the big like bad man in this organization. And it reminds me of like when Washington fired Bruce Allen. It was like, oh, thank God Bruce Allen's gone, but still we have to deal with Dan Snyder. That's what it reminds me of. It's like, oh, we got rid of Easterby, but there's probably other people here still that it's like a problem. Like, it's
who hired Easterby, right? And why is he in a position of authority?
Yeah.
So obviously for me too, it's dead last. I don't think I said it, but it is. And it's I wrestled with putting Arizona there just because at least here you have influence over what quarterback comes in. But like after hearing you talk about Arizona a little bit, like it's really probably not close. So I would say that this is distinctly the last place for me. And
it's funny because like 3 years ago, this like when this coaching position was open and they hired Culley, people were like, This is about as bad as a head coaching position can get. And here we are 3 years later, and it's like, this is about as bad as a head coaching position can get.
It's literally worse, too. Because all that they've done since then is make themselves look more incompetent.
Yeah.
So, because at least then you could have pointed to and been like, yeah, it's a bit messed up because, we messed up the Bill O'Brien GM thing, but it's like, it's his fault that we messed up the roster. So maybe it's not appealing, but like, we'll get back. Like, we'll free up some space and get some picks back, and Deshaun Watson will get out of there. And now that Deshaun Watson is gone, and it's literally less desirable of a job, at least in my opinion. But all right, that leaves just one left. And
by the way, Max is going to be higher than me on the Broncos job, even though I've been like the more pro Russell Wilson guy like all year.
Well, here, and I'll say why. Okay, so Russell Wilson, obviously QB1, they got $9.4 million in projected cap space. They have the 30th overall pick projected because the Niners are still in it. 2 3s, a 4, 5, and a 7. Core stars: Garrett Bowles, Javonte Williams coming back from injury, Cortland Sutton at wide receiver, Baron Browning, who's an up-and-comer, Randy Gregory, Pat Surtain II, Justin Simmons at safety. Ownership: Rob Walton, brand new owner, never made any kind of hires. George Payton has stuck around despite some missteps, whether it's head coaching or quarterback, and one had to go and one of them couldn't go. So obviously head coach long gone. There is some unknown here, and I don't want to give away my reasoning too quickly, but where does this opportunity rank for you?
So it's next to last, mostly because as much as I think Russell Wilson can be turned around, I think it takes a specific person to do that. I think they're smart because I think they're going to hire Dan Quinn instead of Sean Payton. It's a side discussion. Like, I just think it's ridiculous that the Saints are asking for what they want with Sean Payton. I don't think anyone should give up that much for a head coach when you can just go hire
Remind me what
else.
They're asking for.
At first they were saying mid first round pick, and there was a rumor that they want like multiple firsts and seconds, and it's just like no.
You always ask for more than you're going to get. Anytime any negotiation starts with over asking, it should at least.
I mean, it should. But that level of over-asking is a type of over-asking that I feel like can just end negotiations too. And I think that has happened with some teams, including in this position, because the rumors are now like that they're at least Ben Albright, who's like a beat writer for Denver, but he's really like a well-in-tuned throughout the NFL type beat writer. He knows a lot of things that are going on, is saying that they are looking more towards just hiring Dan Quinn now because they don't want to give up. I mean, you could have made the argument that the 30th pick for Sean Payton, okay, like, maybe like that's fine. It's not that high of a first round pick, but it sounds like the Saints want more. And I just, at that point, it's not, in my opinion, reasonable when I think this is like a good roster, but I think they could add a little bit, especially when you don't know how good your quarterback position actually is. And then not to mention, if you come here, like, you have to work with Russell Wilson. Like, you have to make that work. And again, like, as much as I think that some people could make that happen, I think Dan Quinn could do it. I think a lot of coaches who are if I look at most of these positions as like, I've never been a head coach before and I'm trying to get a job. This is not the job I want. Like, I think I'm not convinced that as a new head coach, especially when I don't even know what my specialty is, like, you have to be an offensive coach who wants to work with this type of quarterback, who feels comfortable reviving a guy's career. Like, it's just very specific. And then, yes, the pieces are there, but you don't have a ton of resources. It's new ownership. To a lesser extent with Carolina, I'm like a little hesitant because I don't exactly, they haven't done anything bad yet, but I don't know what's going on quite yet. It's hard to judge. For all I know, like, I get in there and it's a disaster. Maybe it's great, but I don't know. It's hard. I feel more comfortable, quite frankly, with, honestly, as funny as it sounds to some people, like the Colts, because I think that they are, to an extent, like, not dysfunctional, and I'm not certain with this job. And it's hard because the only thing they've really done is trade for Russell Wilson. And as badly as that's gone, like, it's a little unfair to be like, oh, you traded for Russell Wilson, so therefore you're dysfunctional, because it's, everyone was trying to trade for Russell Wilson who needed a quarterback, and just, they were the ones who got it and it didn't work out. But I also think, like, they hired Nathaniel Hackett to get Aaron Rodgers, and that's a little questionable looking now. And then Nathaniel Hackett was kind of disaster. So, like, how certain were you that he was actually going to be a good head coach regardless of who you got at quarterback? these are like small things, but it's enough to add up with the fact that I'm stuck with a quarterback I'm not certain of, that it's not a great job in my opinion.
So I all of those things are true on some level, but again, matter of perspective. If you look at it like, I don't have to work with Russell Wilson. I mean, he's going to be there this year, and I got to try. But if Russell Wilson is not great, he's gone next year. So basically, you have a built-in out for your first year, and not that necessarily you want to be like planning to be bad, but you've got a loaded defense. You've got an offense that could definitely use a little bit more juice. But if I have the option to go in and know that this high-priced quarterback is either one, going to go under my tutelage, going to go back to being one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, or he's guaranteed to be gone because the price tag is too high, then I'm comfortable with that. Because the upside is I have a really good quarterback, or the downside is I get to choose who I want going into next year to be my quarterback. And I have a built-in year, because if he sucks under me, well, he sucked probably worse last year. You know what I mean? So I think the expectations have suddenly become very low, but I also am not locked into multiple years like I am with Kyler Murray. Yeah, the chances that Kyler Murray is better than Russell Wilson are high, but I also don't know necessarily what it's like to work with either of those guys going in. So yeah, Dan Quinn already knows Russell Wilson. He'll know what it's like. But even if I'm a new head coach, I don't know what it looks like for Kyler Murray to work with him on a one-on-one basis. I know that at least Russell Wilson works his ass off. And yeah, maybe he's annoying. So look, personally, I'm not a big Russell Wilson fan. Just as a player, like as a leader, I feel like his very formulated personality. I've talked about that before. But again, regardless of whatever happens, I know that we can push the reset button after 1 year. I don't want to go somewhere where I know I can't push the reset button for my guy within a year if it doesn't play out the way that I would like it to. I also, even though I like the idea of being a coach and GM coming in at the same time, the only place that even exists is Arizona. Everywhere else, you have to come in and deal with the GM that's already there. And at least with George Paton, you know that he's more likely to go than I am, which means that next year, if they don't like him, then we can bring in somebody that I feel like I work really well with. So this is my number 2 job, just to put that out there. I think it's not as appealing as Carolina, and it's only slightly more appealing than Indy, because they'll be willing to invest resources. Like if we get to a point where like this roster is ready to go, like we are a couple pieces away, I know that I can push for that investment. I know that we have the bankroll to work the cap and get everybody I need to be on this roster. So I think Indy and Denver are close. I think Carolina is a distinct number 1. Houston's a distinct number 4. It's a distinct number 5 for me. But I just like the idea that if I'm a defensive head coach, I get to come in and work with all this talent. And if I'm an offensive head coach, I bring in a DC, and that's already set. And then I just got to try and fix this offense. And either way, I can reset next year if I want to.
Okay, so a few things. Well, I'm going to flip this one on your head because you used it before, but they play in the division with Mahomes and Herbert, so that's not fun. But I don't know if that really matters, because if you end up being good, then...
Well, if that's the case, I mean, you got to play in it for...
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. You used it with Carolina, so it's like...
But I'm just saying, if you're talking about the Cardinals,
yeah,
you got to play in the same division as Kyle Shanahan.
Yeah, whatever. It's just Kyle Shanahan. I feel like it's a little different.
What do you mean?
It's one team. Like they've, they're great, but they're also like they got quarterback questions.
A tremendous amount of success. All right.
I
understand that the quarterbacks are challenging.
It's one team versus 2 who have top 4 quarterbacks. Like I don't know. I think there's a difference.
Look,
there, but.
Okay, all 3 of those other teams have been to the Super Bowl at least once, if not multiple times within the last 10 years. Just saying. Under
Cardinals
these head coaches.
On, but yes, true. Okay. I don't know how long Sean McVay and Pete Carroll are going to be around either, so that's a whole thing. But I forget what my second point was going to be with this team, but it's about the first year, right? We're talking about with the Cardinals and Broncos, like both you have a year to kind of to just see how it goes. Mm-hmm. And I think the context of that first year is going to be different, where with Arizona, you're not really going to be pressured to succeed at all. You can really, at a personal level, get to know these players, work with them, improve the culture. Like if you are a player coach, like you really can ingrain yourself well with this roster and get to a point where the positivity going to year two, even if you're like not expected to win, is at a point where like you could really shape this team to rally around you. I think in Denver, I'm not certain that can work for a couple of reasons. One, there might be cultural issues between the team dealing with Russell Wilson. I'm not certain of this, but we've kind of seen it on camera. Like, I don't know how much the team really likes him. And if year one, like I need to be invested, maybe I just don't try at all. Maybe I just like don't care and I make sure Russell Wilson fails. So I come back year two and get somebody new, but I don't think it's in your best interest to do that. So you have to try and work with Russell Wilson and then also work with the rest of the roster potentially that doesn't want to work with Russell Wilson. So that's tough. Even more relevant as I think there is a lot of pressure to succeed here because
I disagree.
This team, this is an organization that is underratedly like one of the model franchises in the NFL. They had never gone more than 3 years without making the playoffs prior to their playoff drought right now. This is a unique drought for them as an organization to not have won as long as they have. They're in a, quite frankly, like drought's the right word. Like this is as bad as they've been over the course of 60 years is right now. They just sold their team. They have a new ownership that's also pressured to win. And you have scenes like in the Colts game where they lose on Thursday night where fans are leaving the stadium. That's never happened before in Denver. And the only reason that worries me is because it reminds me a lot of early on what was happening in Washington. I don't think that the Waltons or the Snyders, but this thing can spiral if you don't win immediately. And you will get a lot of pressure from media and fans who expect a winning team consistently. And if you're not there with that and you're not a team that's winning 11 games, like minimally, like once every 4 years, people get impatient.
I don't think any reasonable person can look at what Russell Wilson did last year and have any semblance of expectation.
But we talked about earlier about how fans can distort the way media presents things, right? And this is still happening in Washington. No one expects the team to win 11 games ever, right? But the fans do. And so locally, when the team is a 9-7 playoff team and Kirk Cousins looks great and there's like all these things improving with Jay Gruden, they look like an up-and-coming team, you have the fan base going, yeah, but they're only 9-7. And I don't think they're winning a Super Bowl anytime soon, and I expect Super Bowls. That's tough. And that's what this organization is going to be doing. You have to win at a level that is higher than I think the Browns or Cardinals are expected to win at, quite frankly.
I think that's fair. I do think that's fair. I think there are some teams that have set their expectations low. I think the Bills were one of those teams, honestly. Mm-hmm. And then you've seen what some winning seasons will do to change that. You know, I think for a while, the Bills fans were like, we're just happy to be here. You know what I mean? Next year will be our year. Now it's like, everything's a mess. We got to make changes. But I think, one thing that might help mitigate that is I would need assurance that I am good to bench Russell Wilson if necessary. Because if I got to roll through the entire season with him as a starter and he sucks, that kind of stuff can happen. But like there is just like a statement to we're benching Russell Wilson because he just can't do it. That resets expectations a little bit, I think. So I feel like if you get the word that if necessary you can bench him because the other players don't want to play with him, and he just can't get it done, and he's honestly not better than the replacement that they have, then that would make a difference to me, I think. But all right.
I mean, that'd be a media storm in itself too then. But like it is what it is, I guess. I mean, it doesn't matter really like in terms of what your decisions are, but it's just this is set up to have you're going to have some adversity here regardless. Sure. Like you're guaranteed. and that's
pretty
just
much
that's
all
tough.
of these will. It would take a lot to not have adversity.
I think like the level of guaranteed with this job and with Houston are different than the other three, personally. But
yeah,
like I'd rather be dealing with injured players, roster struggles than like public relations nightmares.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I get it. Russell Wilson is an albatross. I just feel like it's within 12 months of taking the job, you can you're guaranteed to be able to shed the albatross if necessary. And so with the Texans, the entire organization is the albatross, and with the Cardinals, Kyler Murray is a potential albatross to me. And I know you view that differently. So it's like, I think just the earliest I can pull levers makes a difference to me.
Mm.
All right, so we're getting up onto it now, and one thing I wanted to talk about are these trends, specifically the trend of offensive coordinators being shown the door. So I just want to run through a couple of stats real quick. So now you tell me if you think any of these numbers are off, because I just went through and I'm pretty sure it's all copacetic. But in the NFL right now, or I shouldn't say now, but going into 2022, there were 14 offensive-minded head coaches who are also calling plays. 4 offensive head coaches that were not calling plays and had their offensive coordinator in that role. And then there were 14 non-offensive head coaches. So whether that was special teams in origin or defensive-minded for the majority. So it's an even number of head coaches who call plays and non-offensive head coaches. And then there's 4 who are offensive but don't call plays. Those specifically are those 4 would be the Giants, the Eagles. What a face I've frozen on. Eagles, the Giants. Who else is offensive that does not call plays? The
49ers?
No, Shanahan definitely calls plays.
Okay. Oh, you mean offensive head coaches who don't
offensive head coaches who do not call their own plays. It's the Giants, it's the Giants, it's the Eagles, it's the Cowboys, and there's one more.
Does LaFleur call plays for the Packers?
He does.
Stefanski
calls plays.
Smith does.
I was just literally just looking at it. I did this. I should have written down the exact teams.
Minnesota, Atlanta. I'm just listing off offensive teams.
Minnesota, Atlanta. Riveting podcasting. All right, it'll come to me in a minute because we'll be talking about it. Anyway, so there's only 4 total. 3 of those 4 made the playoffs, though, which I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And game management is something that we talk about being challenging when you're also calling plays, because you have like 10 to 12 seconds to call a play. So you gotta really be hyper focused on what it is that you want to do. Pay attention to what the defense is giving you and call those plays. That's why some of these guys who are calling plays also have like a game management specialist who's in their ear as well. But that's still different than being on the field and actually recognizing everything versus just getting something in your input. It's something that even very good offensive coaches for a long time have taken criticism for. Shanahan has been criticized for that. Andy Reid for years was criticized for that. And it seems like he finally has overcome that and developed into a good.
He might be splitting. We don't know this for sure, but they say they split some play calling with BNA. I don't know if that actually happens at all, but that might be the case.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not, but I think we can give Andy Reid the majority of the credit for that. I mean, It certainly looks like he calls the majority of plays. And then in the playoffs, it's also relatively split. 6 coaches who call plays were in the playoffs. 5 coaches that are not offensive were in the playoffs. But that percentage jumped in notably for the coaches who were offensive minded but not calling plays. So 3 of 4 were in the playoffs this year.
The Lions are the other team.
The Lions are the other team. That's right. So, and they just, whatever, they just missed the playoffs. But, they had a good year. And then in the divisional round, we lost 4 out of the 5 non-offensive head coaches. We lost 2 out of the 6 offensive play caller head coaches, but all 3 of the head coaches who do not call plays made it through. So again, that percentage becomes higher and higher. In the championship round, we have 3 head coaches who call plays left. All 3 of them have been doing it for a pretty long time. And then the Eagles, who are offensive-minded head coach but do not call plays, made it in. No defensive-minded head coaches made it through. Of the head coach firings, we lost 3 of the 14 offensive-minded play callers. We lost 2 of the defensive-minded head coaches, and none of the head coaches who have their offensive coordinator call plays were fired. Offensive coordinators, we lost 7. 7, and that does not include those who went with an entire staff who went out the door. 7 of the 14, we lost 2, so there's 12. 7 out of the remaining 12 non-offensive, tell me if you're following this and it makes any sense. We had 14 non-offensive head coaches. So I'll just call them defense because there's only one special teams-minded head coach left anyway. So we had 14 defensive-minded head coaches. We lost 2 to firings. So there's only 12 left. 7 of those 12, so 58% of them have fired their offensive coordinator and are looking for new ones this offseason. Of the offensive-minded head coaches, only 1 of the, they got fired. 3 got fired, so there's 11. So only 1 of the 11 offensive head coaches released their defensive coordinator. So what I take away from all of that really is that if you are not an offensive-minded head coach, right now there is a struggle to find productive offense. And I don't know exactly why that is. I want to get your take on it. But this is kind of a unique year where all these offensive coordinators have been fired, and it was a down year for offense in general. And it kind of seems like if the strongest voices in the room are offensive-minded guys, it makes it a lot easier to generate offense. You probably invested more heavily there, as well as it seems to be that there might be, it's a small sample size now, but there might be a trend where a full-time game manager at the head coach position who's also offensive minded brings a lot to the table when he doesn't have to also call plays. Yeah. So what is your takeaway from that?
Especially if you're like Shanahan, you're able to like mold offensive minds underneath you, which I think he's done a very good job of. I think the reason for this is actually, I don't know if it's like clear, but I think it's pretty easy to explain. It's just that we have put more value on offense than defense. And because of that, we know what good offense looks like in the NFL, and we know what bad offense looks like in the NFL. And it's pretty easy, like right off the bat, to know what's going to work and what isn't. And because of the game management side, we know when we see Nathaniel Hackett struggling to put in play calls week 1 as well as manage the game, he's probably not cut out for this, like right off the bat. Now maybe he could have turned it around. We've been wrong, but it was like a pretty good sign early on, first impression, right? Whereas with defensive coordinators that end up being head coaches, like, I'm going to use Washington as an example. Like Ron Rivera doesn't really do a lot of coordinating. I think Jack Del Rio does much of the defensive stuff, but like, let's say on the defensive side, like you do a decent job. I think coaching has a less of a sway in terms of how well your defense does. I think that almost by and large, like defensive structure across the league is almost entirely like very similar right now to the point of like what you value in terms of like preventing big plays and trying to get teams to run the ball a little bit more on early downs. And, then you need, a front four that can pass rush and also like everyone's building pretty similarly. Right. Whereas the offense is where the innovation is. And so it's easy to see what the Niners are doing, even from like a casual fan's perspective, and how unique formationally, like how they move guys around, how they use their weapons is versus what, I don't know, what's a very stale offense, like the
Chargers.
Like the Chargers, yeah. So like the Chargers, like it's very like they run similar formations. They run a lot of the same concepts not over and over again, but like the same ideas, like running curls or running like Ohio or running like slants, like or running spacing or running slant flat. It's a lot of that type of stuff. Like it looks like a Madden offense, quite frankly. They're just running a lot of 2x2 shotgun over and over again. They might bring some tight ends in, but that's kind of the extent of their formational interest. And then motion has just become like a big thing. Like it's very easy benchmark is like, how much are you motioning? You should be motioning every play. Like it's just very easy information, and teams that don't generally struggle because it just doesn't really, it's like one of those things. It's like free. Like it just doesn't make sense not to almost. And there are some plays maybe where you don't want a motion just for the simplicity's sake, but it's to the extent of like, how many times you want to play, like have a jet sweep in a game to like give teams that look. That's like how often a team that really knows they're doing offensively is not motioning. So I think we know what it looks like, first of all. And then second of all, because we know the guys who get hired as head coaches have passed the benchmark of this is a good offensive coordinator, and then they generally succeed at their positions. Whereas the guys who get defensive positions that are hiring offensive coordinators are still kind of grasping at straws at finding a guy who actually works generally. And therefore, they're more likely to have a question mark of, hey, we're not really that good, but because offense is more of a needle mover for our team, we really need to make sure we have the right coaching. So we need to fire this guy and figure something else out just to make sure that that's not the reason that we're losing.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that offense is more important. It's been structured that way. I mean, it's harder to win with a great defense than it is with a good offense at this point.
Like there are no like the Jaguars are the last team that might ever, I don't want to say ever because the game is obviously ever changing, but at least the last team in terms of recent history who has gotten to this week in the playoffs on great defense and at best average offense.
The Jaguars
in
have
2017.
Okay. All right. I was going to say, I'm not sure that describes this team right now.
No. Yeah. That's the last team that got to this round playing that way.
Yeah, that might be true. I'd have to think about it a little bit.
Like you could argue the Eagles and the 49ers right now defensively you can make an argument, are better defensively than offensively, and they still have great offenses.
Yes, and I think if you look at even the teams that made it to the divisional round this past year, that's still probably fairly consistent as well.
The Jaguars had a better offense. The Giants were actually way more efficient on offense this year than they were defense. They got big plays on defense, turnovers, but a lot of it was high variance. They were a better offense because of how they were coached this year than they were a defense. Right,
and I think a lot of times you are this might be this might not be fully substantiated. I have to look at it more, but I would imagine that you're also more likely to prioritize defensive players than offensive players at high draft positions. I mean, you look at who are the defensive coaches in the NFL right now. I guess the Patriots, they drafted a guard in the first round. Maybe you're gonna have to look and see if they're not prioritizing like premier offensive positions as well.
But again, like more good examples, like all these teams that are great on defense and had like question marks offensively this year that just barely missed the playoffs. Washington, Jets, Patriots. Probably the worst team that made the playoffs, Tampa, was like in that realm. I know they had Tom Brady. So like that's the difference. Like Tom Brady was the difference between like a playoff team and not. Because
that's not a good one. I mean, So let's say, I mean, let's just look at it really quickly, like who was actually fired briefly, because some have been added over these past couple of weeks later on and throughout the playoffs. So the Jets had a very good defense. Their offense actually had some solid players, underperformed. Mike LaFleur is gone. In the same division, the Patriots had a weird thing going on. Nobody was officially fired.
It was a problem from preseason onward.
Yes, it was a major problem, and they went out and they brought in a true offensive coordinator. And even though their defense was good, they were just as ugly as the Jets on offense for a lot of the year. Let's see, moving down the list, the Titans had a very good defense for a lot of the year. They've had a really good offense that honestly largely just depended on a running game. And let's see if there's a consistency here. Jets heavy on the run game. Patriots heavy on the run game. Titans heavy on the run game. The Ravens, they fire Greg Roman after playoff loss, heavy on the run game. That's already 4 out of the 7.
Steelers almost did. That would have been one as well. That's run heavier.
Yeah, they decided to keep him.
To much of the chagrin to many people there.
But then the Commanders are another one.
Run heavy.
And then the last one. No, there's 2 more.
Chargers are not.
Chargers, not heavy on the run game. Couldn't run the ball at all. And then the other one was similar situation.
But their passing game was effectively just like all just trying to be their run game. Like it was weird. Like they were heavy on short passing concept as a replacement for the run game. Yeah. I don't know. It's just.
Well, it was like there was a bunch of issues there, but also, and then you look at Byron Leff, which is the last one. He's the 7th one.
Which is, I know that they led the league in passing in passing percentages this year, but early downs, oh my God, that team was heavy on the run early downs, and they were horrific at it, which is why they ended up throwing the ball 60 times in so many games because they get down early.
Exactly. By the end of the season, they had basically given up. But I think, not literally every single one is heavy run, but 5 out of the 7. I mean, I think what it's telling us is,
but yeah.
I
think Tampa's run heavy. Like I just think that they got to a point where it was like Brady was just like, oh no, we're throwing the ball. This is ridiculous. Like, well, not even. It's tough. Like it's because it's play calling when you actually have a choice. What are you calling? The Bucs chose run. They had to throw the ball because they didn't have a choice for much of the year.
Mm-hmm. So I don't. So here's the question. I don't want to make a blanket statement because this conversation's been had already, and I don't know if.
I don't think that the answer to our question is run first OCs are bad. I think the answer is if you don't have a plan to throw the football, it doesn't matter if you run first. Or, like you can't get by just running the football in today's league.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the 49ers, I mean, they run the ball a lot, but they also have a lot of pass receiving playmakers, whether it be George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, or Christian McCaffrey. So their passing game is very dynamic as well, even if they're not like a major downfield passing attack. So I think everybody wanted to replicate the Shanahan offense, but it's like it's pretty unique in terms of the players that they have. And the question is, if you're hiring a head coach this year, which is really why I wanted to bring it up, what do you ask of your defensive-minded head coach candidate to do on offense? Like, what do you need? What kind of plan do you need from him? What kind of coordinator do you need from him to justify that selection? Because if there's, without making a linear like correlation or causality, like you need to have an offensive coordinator become your head coach, blah blah blah, without saying that, absolutely, it does seem like there's a trend where there is greater overall success with that offensive prioritization. So if you're gonna go with a defensive coordinator or a past coach who's been a defensive minded head coach, What do you want out of them? What do you need them to tell you and explain to you, and what plan do you need them to have?
So I've actually thought of this. This is my plan if I'm interviewing defensive coordinators as a GM. I'm asking you, who are your names as offensive coordinator when we hire you? Because I need multiple, because you might not get your first choice. I need to know who you're going for. And then I'm interviewing, and this is why I think these coaching searches have gotten so wide. I'm interviewing those names for the head coaching job. And not necessarily because I'm giving them the head coaching job, but because I'm trying to see what they look like in a position of power, in a position of management, because I want to make sure that I've thoroughly vetted that position to the point where I'm just as confident that my offensive coordinator is going to work out as my head coach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. But like, aside from just the names, stylistically and schematically, what would you want? I mean,
there's a lot of answers to that, right? But I think with the way the league is going, like, to be motion heavy, you have to be willing to work with an assortment of what, like, you have to be moldable as a coach. You have to say that player's good, we're going to make him work. You have to make it as easy as possible for a quarterback. So we want more play action. We want more like plays that don't require the quarterback to do a whole lot. Things like sweeps, RPOs, screen passes. You watch the Eagles in the first half of that game against the Giants. And we talked about earlier this week, like Hurts throws for 99 yards at 21 points. And he completed like 8 passes for his first 9 throws. He completed all of them. And I believe 7 of them were screens and or RPOs. And he still was averaging like 11 yards a throw. And that's just crazy. Like, you did not ask him to do much of anything except for like make quick reads, run the ball when you need to, deliver screens accurately. And the Eagles on their own, just with coaching and weapons and offensive line, because the roster's good, were able to get that lead for their quarterback and then let him effectively manage the game the rest of the way, which he does a good job of. But like that's the model right now. Is you need to be able to, in games where you're the better team, put your quarterback in a situation where they can't lose you the game, And not only that, but at this point, not losing the game is average 7 yards a throw. Like, move the ball, because you have like the baseline is moving the ball these days. You can't, if you score 14 points a game, like, you're not winning anymore. So you can't just be this old fashioned, like, I just hate to use this as an example, like early career Brady, where it's like we're throwing the ball 20 times in a game. He averaged 5 yards a pass. He didn't turn the ball over. That's good enough for us, You have to actually move it. And so schematically, you need to be able to be confident that your plays. Shanahan kind of has this thing where he likes answers on his plays. So there's like, we run a play called, if you run a play called scissors, you're trying to beat cover 4, right? Like, you run the scissors concept on both sides. We're beating cover 4. And that's just a problem with the Chargers have, is they have these, like, they have their cover 4 beaters, they have their cover 2 beaters, they have their cover 3 beaters. Like, they have these plays. Shanahan doesn't have he has plays like mesh, which is why we see mesh thriving everywhere, where it's like mesh has the man-to-man beater built in with the crossers, and then the sit route is the zone beater. So you have answers to every coverage on one play. Like, your plays need to have built-in answers to all of these different coverages at once. And if your only answer is to cover 2 or to cover 3, then you're setting a quarterback up to fail when the play call isn't right.
Yeah, and the zone beater helps when you've got the zone answer helps when you've got guys who can just do so much after the catch as well, because you're not just getting it to them and getting tackled for 4 yards or whatever. So, yeah. All right. Well, I mean, this is an interesting conversation. I think that's about as far as we can take it today, and we'll keep an eye on it as we, see who's hired and what kind of moves they make it for their offensive assistants. And obviously, we'll see what percentage of these coaches end up being offensive minded to begin with. So, all right, man. I want to shout out to Noah Ashley, our producer at No Ashtray Sports. We will be back on Sunday morning to pick the AFC Championship games, probably be a shorter show, and then we'll figure out exactly when our recap will come out based on travel plans. Nick, where can everybody find you and all of your Senior Bowl content this upcoming week?
At Nick with Sports and at Defiant Takes page on Twitter. At Nick with Sports, also on Instagram. I should be posting a good amount of stuff. And we might be posting a video on Boomer Bust. I don't know. That might be like our last video. Keep an eye out for that if anyone from Boomer Bust is watching this. we're discussing. We'll figure that out.
Nice. That'll be cool. So you can find all of our content here at Defiant Takes on social media, at Defiant Takes Football on YouTube. Site might be live by the time we have Senior Bowl content, but we'll be posting videos and some content from the actual Senior Bowl itself. And find me on Twitter at TheMaxDean. And I guess that's going to do it for us today. So good show. A lot of interesting stuff that we have covered. Obviously, we're going to be Senior Bowl heavy next week. We'll talk a little bit about the Shrine Bowl from what we gather from a distance. And then it's going to be Super Bowl time. And then we're really getting into the draft. So that'll be it. We will see you all this Sunday.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.